My ex-husband thought I was just another desperate single mom working at the local diner. He had no idea that with one phone call, I could mobilize an entire special operations unit. When he crossed that border with my children, he sealed his fate in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The custody papers felt like sandpaper between my fingers as I read them for the 100th time that morning. Marcus had won again, just like he always did. The judge had been swayed by his expensive lawyer, his pristine house in the suburbs, and his new wife's perfect smile. I was just Vera Martinez, a waitress at Murphy's Diner who lived in a cramped apartment above the hardware store. "Mommy, do we really have to go with Daddy for the whole summer?" Emma's voice was small as she clutched her stuffed elephant. At 8 years old, she was too young to understand why her parents couldn't just get along, but old enough to sense the tension that crackled between Marcus and me whenever we were in the same room. I knelt down to her level, smoothing her dark hair that was so much like mine. "It's just for 2 months, sweetheart. You and Jake will have fun with your dad." Jake, my 10-year-old, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. He'd inherited his father's stubborn streak, but thankfully my sense of justice. "I don't want to go, Mom. Can't we just stay here with you?" The truth was, I didn't want them to go either. Something about Marcus's behavior during our last court hearing had set off alarm bells in my head. He'd been too confident, too smug, like he knew something I didn't. When his lawyer had pushed for the extended summer custody, Marcus had smiled at me with that cold expression I remembered from our worst fights. "I know, baby, but the judge said we have to follow the rules." I hugged them both close, breathing in their familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and playground dirt. "Remember, you can call me anytime, okay? Day or night." Marcus pulled up in his gleaming black BMW at exactly 3 o'clock. Punctuality had always been one of his few virtues, along with his ability to charm judges and juries. As a successful defense attorney, he knew how to present himself as the stable, reliable parent while painting me as the struggling ex-wife who couldn't provide the finer things in life. "Right on time," he said, stepping out of the car in his pressed khakis and polo shirt. His new wife, Stephanie, emerged from the passenger seat like she was walking a red carpet. Everything about her screamed money, from her highlighted hair to her designer handbag. She was everything Marcus had wanted me to be, everything I could never afford to become. "Hello, Vera." Stephanie's voice dripped with false sweetness. "The kids look excited for their adventure." Adventure? As if my children were going on some fun vacation instead of being torn away from their mother for 2 months. I forced a smile and helped Emma with her backpack, while Jake dragged his feet toward the car. "Remember what we talked about," I whispered to them as Marcus loaded their suitcases. "Call me every night before bed." Marcus slammed the trunk with unnecessary force. "Actually, Vera, we'll be pretty busy. The kids might not have time to call every single day." My blood ran cold. "The custody agreement says they can contact me whenever they want." "Of course they can contact you," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "When it's appropriate." I watched helplessly as my children climbed into the back seat of his car. Emma pressed her face against the window, her eyes already filling with tears. Jake gave me a small wave, trying to be brave for his little sister. "I'll see you in August," I called out, but Marcus was already pulling away from the curb. That night, I waited by the phone. 7 o'clock came and went. Then 8. By 9, I was pacing my small living room like a caged animal. I called Marcus's cell phone and got his voicemail. I tried the house phone and Stephanie answered with an irritated sigh. "They're already asleep, Vera. It was a long day." "It's only 9 o'clock. They usually go to bed at 9:30. "Well, things are different here. We have structure." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling the familiar helplessness that had defined so much of my marriage to Marcus. He'd always known exactly how to make me feel small, insignificant, like my feelings didn't matter. The next morning at the diner, I could barely concentrate on orders. I mixed up Table 3's hash browns with Table 7's pancakes and spilled coffee on Mrs. Henderson's favorite blouse. My boss, Murphy, a kind man in his 60s who'd given me a job when no one else would, pulled me aside during the lunch rush. "You okay, kid? You seem like you're somewhere else today." I forced a smile and retied my apron. "Just missing my kids, first day of summer custody with their dad." Murphy's weathered face softened. He'd been through his own messy divorce years ago and understood the particular pain of court-mandated separation. "It'll get easier. 2 months will fly by." But as the days turned into a week, nothing got easier. Marcus wasn't answering his phone. When I drove by his house, all the curtains were drawn and his car wasn't in the driveway. I called the school district where Emma was supposed to be attending summer camp, but they said no one by that name was registered. Panic started to set in. I drove to his law office, but his secretary claimed he was taking a leave of absence for family time. When I pressed for details, she became evasive and suggested I contact his personal attorney. By the second week, I was frantic. I filed a report with the local police, but Officer Davis, a man who'd clearly decided I was just another hysterical ex-wife, barely looked up from his paperwork. "Ma'am, he has legal custody. Unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing, there's nothing we can do." "He's not answering my calls. I haven't spoken to my children in 12 days. "Maybe he's just busy, summer vacation and all." I wanted to scream at his dismissive tone, but I knew it would only confirm his opinion of me as an unstable woman. Instead, I left the station and sat in my rusty Honda Civic in the parking lot, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. That evening, I was cleaning tables at the diner when my phone rang. My heart leaped, thinking it might be the kids, but the number was blocked. "Hello? Mommy?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Emma's voice was barely a whisper, like she was trying not to be overheard. "Emma, baby, where are you? I've been so worried." "I don't know where we are. Daddy says we're on a special trip, but everything looks different. The signs are in Spanish, and I'm scared." My blood turned to ice. "Spanish? Emma, listen to me carefully. Can you tell me what you see outside the window? There's a big church with lots of colors and people selling things on the street. Jake says we're not in America anymore." The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the number was blocked. I sat there in the empty diner, my hands shaking as the full reality hit me. Marcus had taken my children out of the country. He'd kidnapped them and fled to Mexico, probably thinking I was just a powerless waitress with no resources to fight him. He had no idea how wrong he was. I locked up the diner with trembling hands and drove home through the quiet streets of Millfield. To everyone in this small Colorado town, I was exactly what I appeared to be, a divorced, single mother working minimum wage to make ends meet. My neighbors saw me leave for work every morning in my second-hand uniform, watched me clip coupons and shop at thrift stores, knew I drove a car that was older than my marriage. What they didn't know was that before I became Vera Martinez, small-town waitress, I'd been Major Vera Chen, United States Army Special Operations. I'd spent 8 years in classified missions across 3 continents, working with some of the most elite military units in the world. My service record was buried so deep in Pentagon files that even Marcus's expensive private investigator hadn't found it during our divorce. The night I met Marcus at a bar near Fort Carson, I'd been on leave after a particularly brutal mission in Afghanistan. I was tired of the blood and sand, tired of watching good soldiers die for causes that seemed to change with each political wind. He was charming and civilian and represented everything I thought I wanted, a normal life with a white picket fence and children who'd never have to worry about their mother not coming home. So I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I'd walked away from my career, my identity, my power, and tried to become the woman Marcus wanted me to be. For 10 years, I'd played the role of the dutiful wife, then the struggling ex-wife, burying my true self so deep that sometimes I almost forgot who I used to be. But sitting in my apartment that night, staring at my phone and thinking about my children somewhere in Mexico, possibly in danger, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The cold, calculating focus that had made me one of the best covert operatives in my unit. The absolute certainty that came with having the skills and connections to handle any situation. Marcus thought he held all the cards. He thought his money and his law degree made him untouchable. He'd counted on my powerlessness, my inability to fight him on his level. He'd forgotten that some battles aren't fought in courtrooms with expensive lawyers. Some battles are fought in the shadows by people who don't exist in any public record, who can cross borders without leaving a trace and extract assets from hostile territory with surgical precision. I walked to my bedroom closet and moved aside the boxes of winter clothes and old photo albums. Hidden behind a false wall I'd installed when I first moved in was a small safe. I entered the code, my fingers remembering the sequence after all these years, and pulled out items I hadn't touched since my discharge. My secure satellite phone, still charged and ready. A passport in a name Marcus had never heard, with entry stamps from countries that didn't officially exist on my service record. Bank account numbers for funds I'd accumulated during years of hazard pay and combat bonuses, money I'd never touched because I'd been trying so hard to live a simple, honest life. And at the bottom of the safe, a business card that looked innocuous enough, just a name and a phone number, no company logo or address. But I knew that calling that number would set in motion resources that Marcus couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares. Colonel James Hawk Morrison had been my commanding officer during my final 2 years of service. He'd been the one to recommend me for special operations, the one who'd understood that my small stature and unassuming appearance were assets in covert work. When I'd told him I was leaving to get married, he'd given me that card. "You never know when you might need friends in low places," he'd said with a grin. "And Vera, once you're family, you're always family." I'd kept the card as a memento, never imagining I'd actually use it. But as I held it now, I could feel the weight of all the favors owed to me, all the lives I've saved, all the missions I'd completed without recognition or glory. The invisible network of warriors who'd sworn to have each other's backs, no matter how much time had passed. I picked up the satellite phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Morrison." "Hawk, it's Phantom." I used my old call sign, and I heard his sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Well, I'll be damned, Vera Chen. I was wondering when you'd surface again." "I need a favor, Hawk, a big one." His tone shifted immediately from surprise to business. "Talk to me." "My ex-husband just kidnapped my children and fled to Mexico. I need them back, and I need him to understand that taking them was the biggest mistake of his life." There was a pause, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. Hawk Morrison was the kind of man who could move mountains with a phone call, who had connections in every branch of the military and most of the alphabet agencies. More importantly, he'd never forgotten the soldiers who'd served under him with distinction. "How far south did he go?" "Somewhere with colonial Spanish architecture and active street markets. My daughter mentioned colorful churches. Could be anywhere from Tijuana to Mexico City. All have a location within 4 hours. What's your preferred extraction method?" The question sent a chill down my spine, but also a surge of familiar adrenaline. This was the language I'd spoken fluently for 8 years, the world where problems had solutions and every mission had clearly defined objectives. Clean and quiet. I want him scared, not martyred, and I want my children back home without any trauma. Consider it done. "Phoenix, you remember Phoenix?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. Phoenix had been my partner on 17 missions, a man who could slip across any border like smoke and extract targets from the most secure locations. If anyone could find my children, it was him. "Tell Phoenix this is priority 1, personal favor from Phantom." "Roger that. You'll have updates every 6 hours. And Vera, welcome back to the game." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment and felt the familiar transformation beginning. The helpless, desperate mother was still there, would always be there until my children were safe in my arms. But layered over her was someone much more dangerous. The woman who'd once slipped into a terrorist compound in Syria and extracted 3 hostages without firing a single shot. I made myself a cup of tea and opened my laptop to check the news from Mexico. To anyone watching, I would have looked like any other worried parent researching travel warnings. They wouldn't have noticed how my eyes tracked specific details, how I mentally cataloged potential resources and routes, how I was already planning 3 different contingencies based on various scenarios. My phone buzzed with a text from Murphy asking if I'd be in to work the morning shift. I typed back that I had a family emergency and would need a few days off. It was the truth, even if he could never know the full scope of what that family emergency would entail. By morning, I knew exactly where Marcus had taken my children. Hawk's contacts had traced credit card usage, phone pings, and security camera footage to a small colonial town called San Cristobal in Chiapas, about as far south as you could get while still being in Mexico. It was remote enough to feel safe from American law enforcement, but developed enough to have good internet and international banking access. Marcus probably thought he was being clever, choosing a location where his law degree would mean nothing and where he assumed I'd never find him. What he didn't realize was that San Cristobal was a town I knew well from a classified operation 3 years earlier. I knew which hotels the wealthy Americans frequented, which local officials could be bought, and which routes offered the quickest passage back to the U.S. border. More importantly, I knew that a certain Delta Force unit was currently conducting training exercises at a base just 2 hours north of San Cristobal. Training exercises that could easily be modified to include a live rescue scenario. The second call I made was to Agent Lisa Park at the FBI's International Division. Lisa and I had crossed paths during a joint operation in Eastern Europe, and she owed me for saving her cover when things went sideways in Prague. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been expecting my call. "Vera, I heard through the grapevine that you might be coming out of retirement. I need diplomatic cover for a cross-border operation, child abduction case with international implications. Send me the details. I'll have federal warrants and Mexican cooperation within 12 hours. The pieces were falling into place with the precision of a military campaign. Every contact I'd cultivated, every favor I was owed, every skill I'd honed during my years in service was now focused on a single objective: bringing my children home. But even as I made my preparations, I couldn't shake the image of Emma's terrified voice on that phone call. Somewhere in the mountains of southern Mexico, my babies were scared and confused, probably wondering why their mother hadn't come to save them yet. Marcus had made this personal when he'd used my children as weapons against me. He'd counted on my powerlessness, my inability to fight him on equal terms. Tomorrow, he was going to learn that there were some mothers you should never, ever underestimate, and that sometimes the quiet woman serving your coffee has the kind of friends who can make entire buildings disappear in the night. I packed light, the way I'd learned in the service. One small duffel bag with clothes that could blend in anywhere, boots that could handle rough terrain, and a few items that would have been impossible to explain to customs officials in my previous life. The satellite phone went into a hidden pocket, along with the passport that would get me across the border without leaving any trace in official databases. As I locked the apartment door behind me, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I still looked like Vera Martinez, small-town waitress, but my posture had changed, my eyes had hardened, and there was something in my expression that would have made Marcus think twice about his grand plan if he'd been smart enough to see it.
The drive to Colorado Springs took 3 hours, giving me time to plan and prepare mentally for what was coming. I'd spent years trying to forget the particular skills that had made me valuable to the military, but they came flooding back like muscle memory. How to read terrain for tactical advantages, how to move through hostile territory without being detected, how to neutralize threats efficiently and quietly. Most importantly, how to project the kind of quiet authority that made even hardened Special Forces operators pay attention when you spoke. The safe house was exactly where Hawk had said it would be, a nondescript ranch house on the outskirts of the city that looked like any other suburban home. But I knew that beneath its mundane exterior lay communication equipment that could reach anywhere in the world and weapons that could level city blocks. Phoenix was waiting for me in the kitchen, looking exactly like he had 3 years ago. Tall, lean, with the kind of unremarkable features that made him invisible in any crowd. He'd been poring over satellite images and topographical maps spread across the kitchen table, his laptop open to what looked like building schematics. "Phantom," he said without looking up. "Target acquired. 2 children, ages 8 and 10, currently being held at the Casa Colonial Hotel in San Cristobal. 3 adult subjects, primary target, secondary female target, and 1 unknown male who appears to be providing security." I studied the photographs he'd gathered. Marcus looked relaxed and confident, strolling through the town square with Stephanie on his arm, like they were on vacation. There was no sign of Emma or Jake in any of the surveillance shots, which meant they were probably being kept in the hotel room. "Extraction options?" I asked, falling back into the familiar rhythm of mission planning. 3 viable routes: air extraction via helicopter to the training base, overland route through Guatemala to Belize, or direct route north through Mexico to the Texas border. I'm recommending the overland route through Guatemala, less official attention, and we have assets in place. I nodded, studying the maps. It was a sound plan, but it would mean my children would be away from home for at least another week while we navigated international borders and diplomatic channels. What about a direct action scenario? Phoenix looked up from his maps, his expression carefully neutral. "You want to go in personally?" "Those are my children, Phoenix. I'm not sending anyone else to get them." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing the pros and cons in his mind. Direct action meant higher risk, but it also meant complete control over the operation. And there was something to be said for the psychological impact of Marcus discovering that the helpless ex-wife he'd dismissed was the one standing over his bed in the middle of the night. If we go direct action, we'll need local support and a clean exit strategy. I can have a team in position by tomorrow night. What kind of team? Phoenix smiled, and I saw a flash of the warrior I'd fought beside in some of the world's most dangerous places. The kind that specializes in making bad people disappear. The kind that owes Phantom more favors than they can ever repay. As we worked through the night, planning every detail of the operation, I felt a transformation completing itself. The scared, helpless mother was still there, would always be there, as long as my children were in danger. But she was now backed by something Marcus had never seen and could never have prepared for. 8 years of the world's most advanced military training, a network of allies who operated in the shadows, and the absolute certainty that some lines should never be crossed. Marcus thought he'd won by taking my children to Mexico. He thought his money and his legal connections made him untouchable. Tomorrow night, he was going to learn that there were consequences for underestimating the quiet woman who'd once been known in very select circles as one of the most effective covert operatives in the United States military. And my children were coming home. The flight to Mexico City was unremarkable, exactly as I'd planned. I traveled under the identity of Sarah Chen, a freelance photographer documenting colonial architecture in Central America. My camera equipment would explain my presence in remote locations, and the press credentials Phoenix had arranged would open doors that might otherwise remain closed. At the airport, I picked up the rental car that had been reserved under the same name, a dusty white Jeep that would blend in perfectly on the mountain roads leading to San Cristobal. Hidden in the spare tire compartment were items that would have raised questions at customs: night vision equipment, encrypted communication devices, and tools that had served me well in places where the normal rules didn't apply. The drive south took 12 hours, winding through landscapes that shifted from urban sprawl to jungle-covered mountains. I stopped twice for gas and once for food, paying cash and avoiding eye contact with the attendants. To anyone watching, I was just another American tourist heading to the highlands, perhaps running away from something or seeking adventure in Mexico's beautiful colonial towns. But with each mile that brought me closer to my children, I could feel my old instincts sharpening. I noted which vehicles had been behind me for too long, memorized the faces of people who seemed to pay too much attention to me, cataloged potential safe houses and escape routes. The transformation from desperate mother to operational asset was complete by the time I reached the outskirts of San Cristobal. The town was exactly as I remembered it from my previous mission. Narrow cobblestone streets winding between buildings painted in brilliant yellows, blues, and greens. Indigenous women sold textiles and jewelry from blankets spread on sidewalks, while tourists moved through the markets with cameras and guidebooks. The air was thin at this altitude, sharp and clean, with the scent of wood smoke and flowers. Casa Colonial sat on a quiet side street, its facade a warm terracotta color with wrought iron balconies and carved wooden doors. It was the kind of place that attracted wealthy visitors who wanted authentic Mexican charm with American amenities.
Perfect for someone like Marcus, who would want to maintain his comfortable lifestyle while hiding from American authorities. I parked 3 blocks away and walked through the market, my camera ready to capture architectural details while my trained eyes gathered intelligence. The hotel had 2 entrances, the main lobby facing the street and a service entrance in the alley behind the building. Security appeared minimal, just a bored desk clerk and what looked like a maintenance worker who might double as informal security. From my position at a cafe across the street, I had a clear view of the hotel entrance. I ordered coffee and pan dulce, settling in to observe patterns and routines. 20 minutes later, my patience was rewarded. Stephanie emerged from the hotel wearing a flowing sundress and expensive sandals, her hair perfectly styled despite the mountain humidity. She walked with the confident stride of someone who believed they were untouchable. But there was no sign of Marcus or the children. I waited another hour, photographing the cathedral and surrounding buildings while keeping the hotel in my peripheral vision. Finally, Marcus appeared. He looked relaxed, almost vacation casual, in khaki shorts and a polo shirt. He paused at the hotel entrance to light a cigarette, scanning the street with the paranoid alertness of someone who knew he was breaking the law but believed he was too smart to get caught. Still, no children. As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand their routine. Marcus and Stephanie came and went freely, exploring the town like tourists. But Emma and Jake never appeared. They were being kept in the hotel room, probably told they were sick or that it wasn't safe for American children to wander around Mexico. The isolation was a classic control tactic designed to make them completely dependent on their captors. That evening, I checked into a small guest house 6 blocks from Casa Colonial. The proprietor, an elderly woman named Doña Carmen, chatted pleasantly about the weather and asked about my photography project. I paid in cash for 3 nights, explaining that I was documenting churches and might need to travel to nearby villages. In my room, I opened the encrypted communication device and sent a brief message to Phoenix. Target confirmed. 2 adults mobile, 2 subjects confined. Proceeding to reconnaissance phase. His response came within minutes. Local assets in position. Extraction teams standing by. Your call on timeline. I set the device aside and opened my laptop to review the building plans Phoenix had provided. Casa Colonial was a converted colonial mansion with thick walls and traditional courtyards. The second floor had 8 guest rooms, with external staircases leading to private balconies. If Marcus had chosen this hotel for privacy, he would have taken a room at the back of the building, away from street noise. My phone chimed softly with an encrypted message from Agent Park at the FBI. Mexican authorities have been briefed on operation. Federal warrants signed. You have full diplomatic cover for extraction. Everything was falling into place with the precision that came from working with professionals who understood the stakes.
But as I prepared for the night's reconnaissance, I couldn't shake the image of Emma's terrified voice on that phone call. Every hour my children remained in Marcus's control was another hour they were learning that their mother had abandoned them. At midnight, I slipped out of the guest house and made my way through San Cristobal's empty streets. The town transformed after dark, its colorful charm giving way to deep shadows and pools of yellow light from scattered street lamps. Dogs barked in the distance, and music drifted from a cantina several blocks away. Casa Colonial was quiet, most of its windows dark. A single light burned in the lobby where the night clerk dozed behind the reception desk. I circled the building, noting the service entrance, the fire escapes, and the external staircases leading to the balconies. The hotel's colonial architecture provided multiple access points, but it also meant thick walls that would muffle sound and limited sightlines for escape routes. On my second circuit, I noticed light seeping around the edges of blackout curtains in a corner room on the second floor. The balcony faced the internal courtyard rather than the street, and I could make out the shapes of furniture that suggested a suite rather than a standard room. If Marcus was trying to keep the children isolated while maintaining his own comfort, this would be perfect. I positioned myself in the shadows of the courtyard, studying the balcony and window configuration. The external staircase was wrought iron, old but solid. It would support my weight without creaking if I was careful about my foot placement. The balcony doors appeared to be the original wood and glass, secured with what looked like standard hotel locks rather than anything sophisticated. But as I watched, I caught a glimpse of movement behind the curtains. A small shadow passed in front of the light, then another. My heart clenched as I recognized the size and gait. Emma and Jake were in that room, probably sleeping in the same space as their captors to prevent any escape attempts. The tactical part of my mind was already calculating approaches and timing. The emotional part was screaming at me to climb those stairs right now and get my children. But I'd learned long ago that successful operations required patience and planning. Going in unprepared would only put Emma and Jake at greater risk. I withdrew from the courtyard and made my way back to the guest house, where I spent the rest of the night planning 3 different extraction scenarios. Direct assault was fastest but highest risk. Stealth extraction would take longer but offered better odds of getting the children out unharmed. And there was always the nuclear option, having Phoenix's team surround the hotel with enough firepower to convince Marcus that surrender was his only viable choice. By dawn, I'd decided on a hybrid approach. I would handle the extraction personally, but with backup positioned to intervene if things went wrong. It would give me maximum control over my children's safety while ensuring that Marcus understood exactly who he was dealing with. I sent my plan to Phoenix and received immediate confirmation. Team in position by 1800 hours. Medical standing by. Cleanup crew ready for deployment. The day passed with excruciating slowness. I maintained my cover as a tourist photographer, visiting the cathedral and market while keeping Casa Colonial under surveillance. Marcus and Stephanie maintained their routine, leaving the hotel around 10 and returning for lunch, then venturing out again for the evening. During their absences, I caught occasional glimpses of small faces at the window, confirming that Emma and Jake were being left alone for hours at a time. That detail changed everything. If the children were unguarded during Marcus's excursions, I could extract them without risking a confrontation. It would require precise timing and perfect execution, but it eliminated the variables that came with hostile adults in the same space. At 3 in the afternoon, I watched Marcus and Stephanie leave the hotel dressed for dinner out. They walked with the relaxed pace of people planning to be gone for several hours. I gave them 15 minutes to clear the area, then made my move. The service entrance was unlocked, probably a security oversight that was common in small hotels. I slipped inside and found myself in a narrow corridor lined with supply closets and laundry equipment. The sounds of kitchen work came from one direction, but there were no voices nearby. Staff levels were minimal in the afternoon, another advantage I'd noted during my surveillance. The back staircase was exactly where the building plans indicated, a narrow flight of worn steps leading to the second floor. I climbed silently, my soft-soled boots making no sound against the stone. At the top, I oriented myself using the mental map I'd constructed and moved toward the corner suite, room 204. I could hear voices inside, young voices speaking in English. My heart hammered as I recognized Jake's serious tone and Emma's higher pitch. They were talking about home, about whether their mother was coming to get them, about whether they'd ever see their friends again. I knelt beside the door and pulled out the lockpick set I'd carried on 17 missions. The hotel lock was simple, designed to keep out casual intruders rather than determined professionals. It yielded in less than 30 seconds. I eased the door open just enough to peer inside.
Emma sat on one of the beds, clutching her stuffed elephant and staring out the window. Jake was pacing the small sitting area, his jaw set in the stubborn expression that reminded me so much of myself. They were dressed in the same clothes I'd seen them wear to Marcus's car, wrinkled now and showing signs of long wear. "Emma, Jake," I whispered, and they both spun around with expressions of shock and disbelief. "Mommy?" Emma's voice broke as she saw me, and she launched herself across the room into my arms. "Mommy, I knew you'd come. I told Jake you'd find us." Jake was more cautious, studying my face as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. "Mom, how did you get here? Dad said you couldn't find us." I gathered them both against me, breathing in their familiar scent and feeling the knot of terror in my chest finally begin to loosen. They were thin and tired, but they appeared unharmed. There would be time later to deal with whatever psychological damage Marcus had inflicted. "I'm here now, babies. We're going home." But even as I held them, my training kept me alert to sounds from the corridor. We had perhaps an hour before Marcus and Stephanie returned, maybe less if they'd forgotten something or decided to come back early. Every second we stayed in this room increased our exposure. "Listen to me," I said, pulling back to look at them. "We need to leave right now, and I need you both to be very brave. Can you do that for me?" They nodded solemnly, and I felt a surge of pride at their resilience. Despite everything they'd been through, they were ready to fight for their freedom. I quickly surveyed their belongings scattered around the room. "Just take what you absolutely need. We'll get everything else later." Emma grabbed her elephant and a small backpack. Jake collected a book and his baseball cap. Within minutes, we were ready to move. I led them back down the service staircase, pausing at each landing to listen for approaching footsteps. The kitchen sounds continued unchanged, and I could hear the desk clerk's radio playing softly in the lobby. So far, our absence hadn't been noticed. At the ground floor, I held up my hand for them to wait while I checked the alley behind the hotel. It was empty except for a few stray cats and overflowing garbage bins. I guided Emma and Jake through the service door and into the narrow space between buildings. "Stay close to me," I whispered. "We're going to walk to the car like we're just tourists heading back from sightseeing. If anyone stops us or asks questions, let me do all the talking." The walk to the Jeep felt like it took hours, though my watch showed only 7 minutes had passed. Emma held my left hand while Jake walked on my right, both of them fighting to appear normal while their eyes darted nervously at every sound. I forced myself to maintain a casual pace, nodding pleasantly to the few people we encountered on the quiet side streets. At the Jeep, I helped them into the back seat and activated the child locks. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I couldn't risk them opening doors if we encountered trouble during our exit from town. "Are we really going home, Mommy?" Emma asked as I started the engine. "Yes, baby, but first we have to get out of Mexico. It might take a day or two, and we might have to stay in some places that aren't very nice. Can you handle that?" Jake straightened his shoulders, trying to look older than his 10 years. "We can handle anything if we're with you, Mom." As I drove through San Cristobal's winding streets toward the highway, I activated the communication device and sent a single-word message to Phoenix. "Package secured." His response was immediate. "Excellent work. Proceed to Checkpoint Alpha. We'll handle cleanup."
Checkpoint Alpha was a gas station 12 kilometers north of town, positioned at a crossroads that offered multiple escape routes depending on how Marcus reacted to discovering his leverage had vanished. Phoenix would have teams positioned to intercept any pursuit while ensuring our safe passage to the border. As the lights of San Cristobal faded in my rearview mirror, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The first phase of the operation had succeeded beyond my best-case scenario. My children were safe, unhurt, and finally beginning to believe that their nightmare was over. But I knew Marcus wouldn't simply accept the loss of his hostages. He'd probably already called Stephanie's phone, discovering that no one was answering at the hotel. Within the hour, he'd know that someone had outmaneuvered him completely. A man with his ego wouldn't take that lying down. The highway stretched ahead through dark mountains, empty at this hour except for the occasional truck hauling goods between cities. I maintained the speed limit and stayed alert for vehicles that might be following us, but the road remained clear. "Mom," Jake said quietly from the back seat, "Dad told us you didn't want us anymore. He said that's why he brought us to Mexico, to protect us from you." My hands tightened on the steering wheel, but I kept my voice calm and steady. "Your father lied to you, Jake. I've been looking for you every single day since you left. I never stopped wanting you." "We knew he was lying," added, her voice muffled against her elephant. "You always keep your promises. You said you'd find us, and you did." 20 minutes later, I pulled into the gas station that served as Checkpoint Alpha. It looked unremarkable: a few pumps, a small convenience store, and a parking area where long-haul truckers could rest. But I noticed the subtle signs that indicated Phoenix's presence. The lone customer filling his tank moved with military precision. The clerk visible through the store windows stood with the alert posture of someone trained in surveillance. I parked near the restrooms and helped Emma and Jake out of the Jeep. "I need to make a phone call," I told them. "You can use the bathroom and maybe get some snacks from the store, but stay where I can see you." As they walked toward the building, chattering quietly about what kind of candy they wanted, I activated the secure phone. Phoenix answered before the first ring. "Status report. Package secure and undamaged, proceeding north according to plan." "Understood. Be advised that primary target has returned to base and discovered the situation. Local assets report significant agitation and attempts to contact American authorities." I smiled grimly. Marcus was probably calling every lawyer and law enforcement contact he had, trying to mobilize some kind of response. What he didn't realize was that his kidnapping of my children had triggered protocols that went far beyond local police jurisdiction.
Any pursuit? Negative at this time. Primary target appears to be focusing on damage control rather than recovery efforts. Continue to Checkpoint Bravo. We'll maintain overwatch until you cross the border. Checkpoint Bravo was a truck stop near the Guatemala border where we would transfer to different transportation for the next phase of our journey. The route would take us through Guatemala to Belize, then to a private airfield where a plane would be waiting to carry us back to Colorado. It was a complex extraction plan that would normally be reserved for high-value intelligence assets or compromised operatives. But Phoenix had arranged it all with a single phone call, calling in favors accumulated over decades of covert operations. I collected Emma and Jake from the store, where they'd chosen chocolate bars and bottled water with the serious concentration of children who'd been denied normal treats for weeks. As we returned to the Jeep, I noticed a new vehicle in the parking area, a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates. The man leaning against its hood was someone I recognized from my old life. Agent Carlos Mendez, CIA liaison for Central American operations. We'd worked together on a joint task force years ago, and his presence here meant that this operation had attracted attention at the highest levels of intelligence community. "Major Chen," he said as I approached, using my old rank despite my civilian status. Or should I say, Senora Martinez. "Carlos, I wasn't expecting agency involvement." He shrugged, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "When certain names start appearing in diplomatic traffic, people pay attention. Your ex-husband has been making some interesting phone calls tonight." I glanced at my children, who were watching our conversation with curious eyes. What kind of phone calls? The kind that suggest he doesn't understand the legal implications of international child abduction, or the kind of resources that get mobilized when someone threatens the family of a decorated special operations veteran. Carlos pushed away from the SUV and walked closer, his voice dropping to ensure Emma and Jake couldn't overhear. Word came down from very high levels, Vera. Your extraction has full government backing. If your ex-husband tries to interfere with your return to the United States, he'll find himself facing federal charges that will put him away for the rest of his life. The implications were staggering. Somehow, my situation had been escalated beyond a simple custody dispute to a matter of national security. The kind of backing Carlos was describing meant that people in Washington had decided Marcus represented a threat to American interests. I never asked for this level of support. You didn't have to ask. When you carried out 17 classified missions without a single compromise, you earned certain protections. When you walked away from your career to raise a family, those protections remained in place. And when someone decided to use your children as weapons against you, well, he gestured toward the SUV and the subtle signs of additional security presence around the truck stop. Let's just say that some debts never get forgotten. As if to emphasize his point, my secure phone buzzed with a message from Agent Park. Federal marshals are en route to Casa Colonial with arrest warrants for Marcus Williams. Charges include international kidnapping, custodial interference, and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Mexican authorities have been advised to detain all subjects pending extradition. I stared at the message, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and unease. This was justice, but it was also an escalation that would have consequences extending far beyond my family situation. Mom? Emma tugged at my sleeve. Is everything okay? That man looks important. I knelt down to her level, smoothing her hair as I had done countless times during her short life. Everything's fine, sweetheart. We're just getting a little help from some friends to make sure we get home safely. But as we continued north through the Mexican mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that my simple rescue mission had triggered something much larger. Marcus had kidnapped my children thinking he was dealing with a powerless ex-wife. Instead, he'd awakened a network of professionals who treated attacks on their own as acts of war. The phone rang as we approached the Guatemala border, and I saw Marcus's number on the display. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but there was something to be said for letting him hear the voice of the woman who just destroyed his carefully planned disappearance. Hello, Marcus. Vera? His voice was tight with panic and rage. What the hell did you do? There are federal agents at my hotel. They're saying I'm under arrest for kidnapping. You did kidnap our children. You took them across an international border without my consent and hid them from me for weeks. They're my children too. I have legal custody. Summer visitation doesn't include international travel, and it certainly doesn't include cutting off all contact with their mother. I kept my voice calm, professional. You made a mistake, Marcus, a very big mistake. Who are you working with? How did you find us so fast? For the first time in our entire relationship, I heard fear in his voice. Real fear, the kind that came from realizing you'd underestimated your opponent in ways that might prove fatal. I'm exactly who I've always been, Marcus. You just never bothered to find out. The line went quiet except for his heavy breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Gone was the confident attorney who dismissed me as a failure. In its place was a man who'd glimpsed something beyond his understanding. This isn't over, Vera. I'll fight these charges. I'll prove that you're the one who... I ended the call and turned off the phone. There would be time later to deal with whatever legal battles Marcus wanted to pursue. Right now, my only priority was getting Emma and Jake safely across the border and back to American soil. The Guatemala checkpoint was a study in contrasts. Ramshackle buildings and rusted signs on the Mexican side, neat uniforms and electronic scanners on the Guatemalan side. The border guards recognized my photography credentials and waved us through after a cursory examination of our passports. As we drove into Guatemala, Emma fell asleep against Jake's shoulder, finally relaxed enough to let exhaustion overtake her.
Jake remained alert, watching the unfamiliar landscape roll past the windows. "Mom," he said quietly, "are you really just a waitress?" The question caught me off guard. During our extraction, Jake had seen me move with confidence through foreign territory, communicate with people who appeared at exactly the right moments, and navigate situations that would have overwhelmed most civilians. "Why do you ask, honey?" "Dad always said you were just a failure who couldn't do anything right."
But tonight, you were different, like you knew exactly what you were doing. I met his eyes in the rearview mirror, seeing an intelligence there that reminded me of myself at his age. He deserved an honest answer, or at least as honest as security classifications would allow. I used to have a different job before I married your father, a job that required special training and skills. When he took you and Emma away, I had to remember how to use those skills. What kind of job? The kind where you help protect people who can't protect themselves. He nodded solemnly, seeming to understand that some details would have to wait until he was older. But I could see him processing this new information about his mother, reassessing everything he thought he knew about our family dynamics. "Does Dad know about your old job?" "No, Jake, I never told him." "Why not?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since this nightmare began. Why had I hidden such a fundamental part of my identity from my husband? Why had I let him dismiss and diminish me when I had the power to correct his misconceptions? Because I thought it didn't matter anymore. I thought being your mother was the only job that counted. But it did matter, didn't it? It mattered tonight. "Yes," I said quietly, "it mattered tonight." We drove in comfortable silence after that, the Jeep eating up kilometers of dark highway as we moved steadily away from Mexico and towards safety. Behind us, Marcus was probably discovering that his legal problems had multiplied exponentially. Federal kidnapping charges carried sentences that would keep him in prison until Emma and Jake were adults. Ahead of us lay questions and complications I hadn't fully considered. How would I explain this to my neighbors in Millfield? What would I tell Murphy when I returned to work? How much of the truth could I share without compromising operational security? But those were problems for tomorrow. Tonight, my children were safe in the back seat of my rented Jeep, heading home to the life Marcus had tried to steal from them. And somewhere in a hotel room in San Cristobal, my ex-husband was finally learning that some women should never, ever be underestimated. The secure phone buzzed with a message from Phoenix. "Package delivery confirmed for 800 tomorrow. Welcome home, Phantom." I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that had been there since the moment Marcus drove away with Emma and Jake. Tomorrow, we'd be back on American soil, back to the small apartment above the hardware store and the life I'd built from nothing after my divorce. But something fundamental had changed during these days in Mexico. I'd remembered who I used to be, what I was capable of when pushed to my limits. And my children had seen their mother as something more than just a waitress struggling to make ends meet. The road stretched ahead through the Guatemalan highlands, carrying us toward morning and the promise of home. The private airfield in Belize was nothing more than a cleared strip of dirt surrounded by jungle, but the plane waiting for us represented everything money and connections could accomplish. A sleek Citation jet with American registration, its engines already spinning as we approached in the convoy of vehicles that had escorted us from the Guatemalan border. Emma pressed her face to the window of our escort vehicle, eyes wide at the sight of the aircraft. "Are we really flying home in that, Mommy?" "We are, sweetheart." I helped her and Jake out of the back seat, noting how Phoenix emerged from the second vehicle with the fluid motion of someone always ready for trouble. Behind his sunglasses, his eyes swept the perimeter constantly, even though this airfield was secured by people we trusted. "Flight plan filed for Colorado Springs," he reported as we walked toward the plane. "Weather's clear all the way home. You should be back on American soil in 4 hours." 4 hours! After weeks of not knowing where my children were, after days of careful planning and execution, we were 4 hours away from ending this nightmare. But as I helped Emma and Jake up the aircraft stairs,
I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus wasn't finished causing problems. The jet's interior was luxurious in the way that government black budgets allowed. Leather seats, secure communication equipment, and a galley stocked with enough supplies for international flights. Emma and Jake settled into seats by the windows, their faces pressed against the glass as the engines wound up to takeoff power. As we lifted off from the jungle airstrip, I activated the secure phone one final time. Agent Park answered immediately, her voice crisp with the efficiency of someone managing multiple crisis situations simultaneously. "Vera, I have updates on your ex-husband's situation. Are you on a secure line?" "Affirmative." "What's his status?" "In custody of Mexican federal police pending extradition. His lawyer tried to claim diplomatic immunity through some connection to a State Department contractor, but that got shut down fast when we explained exactly who he'd tangled with." I frowned, staring out at the Gulf of Mexico passing beneath us. "What State Department connection?" "Apparently his new wife has some kind of consulting contract with Embassy Security Services. Nothing classified, just administrative work, but Marcus thought it might provide some protection." The pieces clicked into place with uncomfortable clarity. Stephanie's expensive lifestyle, her confidence during the custody hearings, her knowledge of how to navigate international travel with kidnapped children. She hadn't been just a trophy wife. She'd been Marcus's inside source for information about government procedures and protocols. "Lisa, I need everything you can find on Stephanie Williams, formerly Stephanie Chen. If she's been feeding Marcus information about federal investigation procedures, this goes beyond simple kidnapping." "Already on it. Her security clearance was revoked the moment we identified her involvement in the abduction. Turns out she's been accessing files she had no business reviewing, including background checks on certain divorced military personnel." My blood ran cold. Stephanie had been researching me, probably trying to find weaknesses Marcus could exploit in court. Instead, she'd stumbled across references to classified operations and personnel files that should have been completely sealed. How much did she see? Enough to know you weren't really a waitress, not enough to understand what she was dealing with until it was too late. The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just kidnapped my children on a whim. He'd had inside information suggesting that his ex-wife had a hidden background worth investigating. What he hadn't counted on was that hidden background including the kind of training and connections that could reach across international borders. What are his chances of beating the federal charges? Non-existent. International kidnapping, unlawful flight, conspiracy to commit custodial interference. He's looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. His lawyer is already floating plea bargain options. I ended the call and stared out at the ocean, processing the reality that Marcus would likely spend the rest of Emma and Jake's childhood in federal prison. Part of me felt satisfaction at the justice of it, but another part worried about how my children would handle growing up knowing their father was incarcerated because he'd tried to steal them from their mother.
"Mom?" Jake's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Is Dad in trouble?" The question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that his father is facing decades in prison for kidnapping? How do you help children understand that the parent they'd trusted had committed crimes serious enough to destroy their family? "Yes, honey. Your dad broke some very serious laws when he took you to Mexico without my permission. He's going to have to face the consequences for that." Emma looked up from her coloring book, her expression grave. "Will we see him again?" "I don't know, sweetheart. That will depend on a lot of things we can't control right now." The rest of the flight passed in relative quiet. Emma fell asleep halfway through, exhausted by the emotional roller coaster of the past few days. Jake remained awake, staring out the window and asking occasional questions about where we were flying over and how long it would take to get home. When Colorado Springs appeared below us, its familiar grid of streets and suburban developments, I felt emotions I hadn't allowed myself during the operational phase. Relief so intense it made my hands shake. Gratitude for the network of professionals who'd moved mountains to bring my children home. And underneath it all, a quiet fury that Marcus had put us all through this trauma for his own selfish purposes. The landing was smooth, And as we taxied toward the private terminal, I could see Murphy waiting beside his old pickup truck. Dear, reliable Murphy, who'd closed the diner early to drive to the airport and welcome us home. Behind him stood Agent Park, her federal credentials visible on her jacket, and two other people I didn't immediately recognize. "Mommy, is that Mr. Murphy?" Emma pressed against the window, recognizing the familiar figure from countless visits to the diner. "It is, baby. He came to take us home." As we descended the aircraft stairs onto American soil, Murphy stepped forward with a smile that creased his weathered face. "Welcome home, kids. I've got ice cream in the truck and your mom's apartment all ready for you." Emma launched herself into his arms with the trust that children reserve for adults who've never let them down. Jake was more reserved, but accepted Murphy's handshake with the dignity of someone who'd grown up considerably in the past few weeks. Agent Park approached as Murphy loaded our minimal luggage into his truck. "We need to debrief, but it can wait until tomorrow. Right now, I imagine you just want to get these kids settled." "Thank you, Lisa, for everything. Thank Phoenix and Colonel Morrison, and thank whatever instincts told you to keep your military background classified during your divorce. If Marcus had known what he was really dealing with, he might have tried something even more dangerous." The drive back to Millfield took 40 minutes through familiar Colorado landscape. Emma and Jake pressed against the windows, pointing out landmarks and chattering about how good it felt to see American road signs again. For them, the ordeal was over. They were home with their mother, safe and surrounded by people who cared about them. But as we pulled up to the hardware store and climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, I knew the real work was just beginning. My children had been traumatized by their father's betrayal and their weeks in captivity. They'd learned things about their mother that would take time to process. And somewhere in a Mexican jail cell, Marcus was probably still trying to figure out how his simple custody grab had turned into an international incident. The apartment felt different when we walked through the door. Smaller somehow after the grand hotels and dramatic landscapes of our journey. But it was home, and Emma immediately ran to her bedroom to check that her stuffed animals were still arranged exactly as she'd left them. Jake was more subdued, sitting on the couch and studying me with the same analytical expression I'd seen in the mirror countless times during my military career. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey." "When Dad took us away, were you scared that you'd never find us?" The question cut straight to the heart of every parent's worst nightmare. The weeks of not knowing where they were, of lying awake imagining all the ways Marcus could have harmed them, of feeling completely powerless while my children were at the mercy of someone who'd already proven he couldn't be trusted. Yes, Jake, I was more scared than I've ever been in my life. "But you knew you could find us, didn't you, because of your old job?" I sat down beside him, choosing my words carefully. "I hoped I could find you. I knew I had friends who would help. But there are no guarantees in situations like that. Sometimes bad things happen even when good people are trying to prevent them." He nodded solemnly, and I could see him filing away this information, along with everything else he'd learned about the complexity of adult relationships and the sometimes blurred lines between right and wrong. That evening, as I tucked Emma into her own bed for the first time in weeks, she asked the question I'd been expecting. "Mommy, why did Daddy lie to us about you?" "I think your daddy was angry about our divorce, and sometimes when people are angry, they say things that aren't true." "But you're not a failure, are you? You're actually kind of amazing." I kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her freshly washed hair. "I'm just a mom who loves her children very much. That's the most important thing about me." But as I turned out the lights and retreated to my own bedroom, I knew that simple definition no longer captured the complete truth. Over the past few days, I'd been forced to acknowledge parts of myself I'd tried to leave behind. The strategic thinker who could plan complex operations under pressure. The warrior who would cross any line to protect her family. The woman who commanded respect from some of the most dangerous people in the world. The phone rang as I was getting ready for bed, and I saw Hawk Morrison's number on the display. "Colonel, Vera, hell of a thing what you pulled off down there. Half the Pentagon is talking about it. I just wanted my kids back. And you got them back, along with teaching that ex-husband of yours a lesson he won't forget."
But there are some folks up here wondering if maybe you've been wasting your talents slinging hash in a small-town diner. The suggestion hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to consider. Return to active duty. Resume the career I'd abandoned for marriage and motherhood. Trade the anonymity of civilian life for the adrenaline and purpose of military service. My children need stability, Hawk. They've been through enough trauma. I'm not talking about full deployment rotations. There are positions available in training and oversight, stateside assignments that would let you use your skills without compromising your family responsibilities. Think about it, Vera. You've got experience and instincts that can't be taught. And after what you just accomplished, there are people who want to make sure those skills stay in the right hands.
After I hung up, I stood at my bedroom window looking out over Millfield's quiet streets. For 3 years, this small town had been my refuge from a world of classified missions and moral ambiguities. I'd found peace in the simple routine of serving coffee and eggs to farmers and truckers who didn't care about my past as long as I kept their cups full. But the past few days had reminded me that some identities can't be permanently discarded. When my children's safety was threatened, I'd become Major Vera Chen again without conscious decision. The skills and instincts had been there waiting, like muscle memory that never fully fades. The question was whether I wanted to acknowledge that part of myself permanently, or if I preferred to return to the comfortable fiction that I was just a waitress who'd gotten lucky during a family crisis. 3 days later, I returned to work at Murphy's Diner. The familiar routine of morning prep and customer service felt both comforting and somehow inadequate after the intensity of international operations. Murphy asked no questions about my family emergency, but I caught him studying me with the perceptive eyes of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize when people had changed in fundamental ways. The first customer of the day was Mrs. Henderson, who ordered her usual coffee and wheat toast while chattering about the gossip she'd heard regarding my ex-husband's legal troubles. "Such a shame about Marcus," she said, shaking her head. "I heard he got involved with some kind of international scandal. You must be so relieved that the children weren't caught up in anything dangerous." I poured her coffee with steady hands, maintaining the expression of concerned normalcy I'd perfected over years of operational security. "Yes, ma'am, I'm just glad they're home safe." But as the morning wore on and regular customers stopped by to express sympathy and curiosity about my family situation, I found myself increasingly restless with the performance. These were good people who cared about me and my children, but I was lying to them by omission with every casual response about being lucky that the authorities found Marcus so quickly. Around noon, Jake and Emma stopped by on their way to the library. Emma immediately claimed a booth and pulled out her coloring books, comfortable in the familiar environment where she'd spent countless hours after school. Jake was more reserved, still processing everything that had happened and trying to reconcile his previous image of his mother with what he'd witnessed in Mexico. "Mom," he said quietly as I refilled water glasses at nearby tables, "some kids at the library were talking about Dad being arrested. They said he was on the news." My heart sank. I'd hoped to control the flow of information about Marcus's situation, giving Emma and Jake time to adjust before facing questions from their peers. But in a small town, news traveled fast, especially when it involved federal charges and international incidents. "What did you tell them?" "That Dad made some mistakes and had to go away for a while, but they kept asking questions about how the police found him in Mexico so fast, and I didn't know what to say." It was a legitimate concern. The official story released to local media focused on international cooperation between law enforcement agencies, but anyone with knowledge of how slowly bureaucracies typically operated would wonder about the suspiciously rapid resolution of the case. "You did the right thing, honey. Some things are private family business, and you don't have to explain everything to other people." But even as I said it, I knew the questions would continue. Children are naturally curious, and Emma and Jake's friends would want details about their dramatic adventure. How long could we maintain the fiction that their mother was just a lucky waitress who'd happened to benefit from unusually efficient police work? That evening, as I helped with homework and prepared dinner in our small kitchen, Jake brought up the subject that had been weighing on both our minds. "Mom,
"Are you going to keep working at the diner?" "Why wouldn't I?" He shrugged, but I could see him choosing his words carefully. "It's just that when we were in Mexico, you seemed different, like you were doing something important instead of just serving food." The observation stung because it contained truth I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. For 8 years, military service had provided me with purpose beyond personal satisfaction. I'd been part of something larger than myself, using skills that made real differences in situations that mattered on international scales. Waitressing was honest work that supported my family, but it didn't engage the parts of my mind and training that had been activated during our recent crisis. The strategic planning, the operational decision-making, the coordination with skilled professionals working toward common objectives. "What I do at the diner is important too, Jake. It's how I earn money to take care of you and Emma." "I know, but Colonel Morrison called again today, didn't he?" I paused in stirring the pasta sauce, surprised by his perception. "How did you know that?" "Because every time he calls, you get that look like you're thinking about something serious, and then you spend the rest of the day being extra careful about normal stuff, like you're trying to prove to yourself that you're still regular." The insight was uncomfortably accurate. Hawk's calls were becoming more frequent, and each conversation included more specific details about positions available for experienced operatives who wanted to transition into training and oversight roles. Desk jobs with excellent benefits, security clearances that would never expire, and the satisfaction of preparing the next generation of military personnel for the challenges I'd faced in the field. The offers were tempting, not just for financial reasons, but because they represented acknowledgement of skills and experience I'd spent years pretending didn't matter. But accepting would mean abandoning the anonymity I'd cultivated in Millfield, trading the simple identity of single mother and waitress for something more complex and potentially dangerous. "Jake, if I were to consider a different kind of job, something that used my old training, how would you feel about that?" He looked up from his math homework with serious eyes. "Would it mean you'd have to go away again?" "No, honey. Any job I considered would keep me here with you and Emma. But it might mean some changes in how we live, the kind of security we have to maintain, the questions we can and can't answer about our lives." He nodded slowly, and I could see him weighing the implications with maturity beyond his years. "Would it make you happier?" The question caught me off guard because it implied he'd noticed my restlessness, my struggle to readjust to civilian routines after remembering what it felt like to operate at the highest levels of government service. "I don't know, Jake. I'm happy when you and Emma are safe and healthy. Everything else is secondary to that." "But you were happy in Mexico too, weren't you, when you were rescuing us?" I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, abandoning dinner preparation for this conversation that was clearly important to him. "I was terrified in Mexico, terrified that something would go wrong and I'd lose you both forever. But you were also excited, weren't you? Like you were finally doing something you were really good at." The perceptiveness of the observation made me wonder what else he'd noticed during our extraction from San Cristobal. Had he seen the confidence that came with operating in my element? The satisfaction of successfully completing a mission that had required every skill I'd developed over years of specialized training? "Yes," I admitted, "I was excited, and that scared me almost as much as the danger did." "Why?" "Because I'd spent 3 years trying to convince myself that part of my life was over, that I was just a regular mom who happened to have some unusual experiences in her past. But when you and Emma were in danger, I couldn't pretend anymore." Jake nodded thoughtfully, then returned his attention to his homework. But I could see him processing the information, adding it to his growing understanding of who his mother really was beneath the surface identity she'd maintained for his entire life. That night, after both children were asleep, I called Hawk Morrison back. "I've been thinking about your offers." "And?" "What kind of position are we talking about, specifically?" "Training coordinator for special operations personnel transitioning to civilian contractors. Based at Peterson Air Force Base, 20 minutes from your apartment. Regular hours, federal benefits, and the chance to help people navigate the same challenges you faced when you left active duty." It was perfect, almost suspiciously so. A job that would use my experience and training without requiring deployment or extended travel.
work that would have meaning beyond personal financial security, helping military personnel avoid some of the mistakes I'd made when trying to abandon my identity completely. What would it mean for my family's security? Enhanced background monitoring for you and the children, secure communications, and resources available if anyone tries to use your family against you again. Think of it as insurance against future Marcus Williams situations. The offer was tempting for reasons beyond professional fulfillment. Enhanced security would mean Emma and Jake could grow up knowing their mother had the resources to protect them from any threat, and the federal benefits would provide educational opportunities and financial stability I could never achieve on a waitress's salary. I need some time to think about it. Of course, but Vera, don't wait too long. There are people in Washington who remember your service record. They've been watching your situation with interest, and they're prepared to offer resources that go beyond normal personnel packages. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen drinking tea and staring at the classified documents I'd retrieved from my safe. Commendations, performance evaluations, and mission reports that painted a picture of a soldier who'd excelled in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. For 3 years, I'd treated these papers like museum pieces, artifacts from a life I'd chosen to leave behind. But reading them now, I felt a pride I'd forgotten I was capable of experiencing. I'd been genuinely good at military service, not just competent, but exceptional in ways that had earned respect from people who didn't give praise lightly. The question was whether I could integrate that identity with my role as Emma and Jake's mother, or if the two lives were fundamentally incompatible. The answer came to me gradually over the following weeks, as I watched my children adjust to being home while processing their traumatic experience with their father. They were resilient, as children often are, but they'd been changed by witnessing their mother's transformation from apparent powerlessness to decisive action. Emma had always been confident, but now she carried herself with the security of someone who knew her mother could handle any crisis. Jake had become more thoughtful, asking questions about ethics and justice that suggested he was developing a sophisticated understanding of moral complexity. Most importantly, both children seemed proud of what I'd accomplished. They didn't see my military background as something shameful to hide, but as evidence that their mother was capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The decision crystallized one morning when Emma asked if she could bring career day materials about my old job to her class presentation. "What would you tell them about what Mommy used to do?" "That you helped protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and that you were really, really good at it." That afternoon, I called Hawk Morrison and accepted his offer. The transition took 6 weeks to complete, involving background updates, security clearances, and negotiations about my work schedule that would accommodate school events and family responsibilities. Murphy was disappointed to lose me as an employee, but understanding about my need to pursue better opportunities. "You were always meant for bigger things than slinging hash," he said as I worked my final shift. "Just don't forget us little people when you're running government operations." On my first day at Peterson Air Force Base, I wore civilian business attire and carried credentials that identified me as a Department of Defense contractor specializing in personnel transition services. My office was small, but equipped with secure communications and access to databases containing information about military personnel facing discharge or career changes. My first assignment was reviewing the files of soldiers leaving special operations units and developing individualized transition plans that would help them avoid the identity crises and adjustment difficulties that had nearly destroyed my own marriage. It was meaningful work that required both my operational experience and hard-earned wisdom about the challenges of civilian reintegration. More importantly, it was work I could discuss openly with Emma and Jake, helping them understand that their mother was using her skills to help other military families navigate difficult transitions. 6 months later, I received a call that brought the Marcus situation to its final resolution. Agent Park's voice carried a satisfaction that suggested justice had finally been served comprehensively. "Vera, I wanted to give you the update personally. Marcus Williams pled guilty to all federal charges in exchange for a sentence reduction.
He'll serve 12 years minimum, with supervised probation afterward that includes restrictions on international travel and contact with you or the children. What about Stephanie? Conspiracy charges, loss of security clearance, and a civil service ban that means she'll never work for the government again. She's also facing a separate investigation for unauthorized access to classified personnel files. The news should have brought closure, but I found myself feeling oddly empty about Marcus's fate. 12 years was a long time, long enough for Emma and Jake to grow up and form their own opinions about their father's choices. By the time he was released, they'd be adults with their own lives and perspectives. "There's one more thing," Agent Park continued. "Marcus wants to write letters to the children. Prison correspondence, supervised and reviewed before delivery. It's his legal right, but you have the authority to refuse on their behalf until they're old enough to decide for themselves." I considered the implications. Letters from prison would be a constant reminder of their father's crimes and the trauma he'd inflicted on our family. But they might also provide some kind of closure, a way for Emma and Jake to understand their father's motivations without the confusion and fear that had characterized their final interactions. I'll discuss it with them and let you know. That evening, I presented the situation to Emma and Jake with the same straightforward honesty I'd learned to use in discussing complex military ethics with young soldiers. They deserved to understand their options and participate in decisions that would affect their emotional well-being. Jake's response was immediate and definitive. "I don't want to hear from him until I'm grown up enough to decide what I think about what he did." Emma was more conflicted. "Maybe when I'm older, I might want to know if he's sorry, but not now. It would make me too sad." I called Agent Park back and declined the correspondence on their behalf, with the understanding that the option would remain available when they reached majority age. Over the following months, our new routine solidified into something that felt both familiar and completely different from our previous life. I still lived in the same apartment above the hardware store, still shopped at the same grocery stores, and attended the same school events. But my work at Peterson gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing during my years at the diner. More importantly, Emma and Jake were growing up with a more complete understanding of who their mother was and what she was capable of. They saw me using skills and knowledge that commanded respect from military professionals, and they understood that our family had resources and protections that extended far beyond our small-town existence. The transformation was most evident during a school event where parents were invited to discuss their careers with students. Instead of awkwardly deflecting questions about serving food, I could talk openly about helping military families transition to civilian life, about the importance of using skills developed in service to benefit others, and about the satisfaction that came from meaningful work. Emma and Jake sat in the front row with expressions of pride that made every difficult decision worthwhile. They were learning that their mother was someone worth respecting, someone who could handle any crisis and protect anyone who needed protection. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed, she asked one final question about our experience in Mexico. "Mommy, if someone tried to take us away again, would you be able to find us?" I smoothed her hair and kissed her forehead, thinking about the secure communications in my office, the network of professionals who now knew our situation, and the resources available through my government position. "Yes, baby, I would find you anywhere in the world." She smiled and closed her eyes, secure in the knowledge that her mother possessed both the skills and determination to keep her safe from any threat. As I turned out the lights and headed to my own bedroom, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. Marcus had kidnapped my children thinking he was dealing with a powerless ex-wife who couldn't fight him on equal terms. Instead, he'd awakened something in me that I'd tried to leave buried, forcing me to acknowledge that some identities run too deep to be permanently discarded. The quiet woman serving coffee at Murphy's Diner had resources Marcus couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares. One phone call had mobilized Delta Force operators, CIA assets, and federal law enforcement agencies in a coordinated response that crossed international borders and brought the full weight of American military and intelligence capabilities to bear on a simple custody dispute. Now, Emma and Jake are growing up knowing their mother was someone who commanded that kind of respect and wielded that kind of influence. They were learning that strength comes in many forms, that protection requires both love and capability, and that some people should never, ever be underestimated. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.